Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. All right, so the big thing that we need to clarify real quick that I need to make sure that we all know what's going on and stuff like that is I know that we've been discussing the Industrial Revolution in context and stuff like that, but what we need to understand is the Industrial Revolution that we are focusing on right now is the one that's going to be evolving in Britain, because the Industrial Revolution doesn't really spread to the continent up until, give or take, around like the 1820s, all right, if you want to even make the argument and stuff like that. Now, when we're going into depth with this, and also just to give you a heads up, this flip is definitely going to be below 25 minutes due to the fact that I'm just going to teach with this recording until the announcements come on. And when the announcements come on, I'm wrapping it up. Might be under 20 minutes, but let's get after it, all right? So we are mainly talking about, though, the evolution of this entire thing in that all-important island known as the British Isles, right? So when we're going into it, now we're looking at, we talked about the middle class today in class, right? We talked a lot about the industrial middle class, what's going on, how that's going to affect women's roles in society due to the fact that y'all are a bunch of dynamic, young, future female leaders, and you need to know that the Industrial Revolution might be one of the worst things that's ever happened to women in a really long time, right? So we understand that. We understand a lot of different things. We don't really need to talk about the upper class because we've been spending most of European history talking about the nobility and the upper class anyway. But we did talk about how they're going to reinvest that profit in earnings and how it would be very easy for the middle class to fall into that lower class, etc., and so on. But now what we're getting into is what life was like working in those early factories, right? So first and foremost, just so we understand, the first factories were put up in the countryside, right? So the very first factories that were mostly cotton mills at the time were actually put up inside, or excuse me, not inside, outside of cities in rural areas next to fast-moving bodies of water. Now, why is this? Because the earliest form of power for these early factories were things like the water frame, where they were using water wheels and actually moving water and stuff like that to power these early factories. Now, due to that, it's going to become very important to clarify that workers, okay, are going to have to be like coaxed into coming into these things, okay? So when these first factories get put up, you have to understand that working conditions inside of them from the get-go in the 1700s are not going to be very fun for the worker, okay? They're very large and intense. They don't really have much ventilation. They can be very hot and stuffy. And then on top of everything else, if you were a worker in one of these early factories in the 1700s, the late 1700s, while the French Revolution is going on, before we ever really get to the 1800s, because they're these ones that are kind of set up in the countryside, workers can easily be put to fines for different infractions. Like you show up to work, you decide to leave the cottage industry, you go out into this early factory, and then you drop something, or you break something, or you tear something, or you damage a spinning jenny or something like that. You could lose pay. Children also were sometimes beaten by managers in front of their parents if they had parents at all that were there working with them, because we'll get to the whole orphanages and stuff like that and foundling hospitals and how that was actually affected by the Industrial Revolution here in about 2 seconds. So this doesn't sound like a very fun existence. You're going in there hoping that you can actually work a certain amount of time and make a certain amount of money. Now that's the other really big thing as well. You're working a consistent amount of time. You have to show up on time. You got to work a certain amount of time. It's also very monotonous, arduous work. This doesn't sound very fun at all, does it? And also, on top of everything else, English factories at the time really tended to resemble these things known as English poorhouses, right? An English poorhouse is one of the earliest form of social welfare programs started in England. They were actually opened up in the early 1700s. Charles Dickens is actually going to comment on them heavily. I don't know if any of y'all know anything about Oliver Twist, but Oliver Twist was an early Charles Dickens novel that was actually written by him and described kind of the conditions in pre and post, or like kind of the conditions of pre-industrial society and stuff like that. Oliver Twist is an orphan, and he lives inside of one of these poorhouses or a foundling hospital or something like that. And he literally begs the cook at one point. He's like, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" Exactly, and he gets kicked out of there and ends up having to be like a wraith on the actual, not a wraith, but like a very like a fiendish little pickpocket on the streets and stuff like that. Well, the thing about it is conditions for Oliver in that poorhouse were awful. You were fed very little. You had to work just so you could get any kind of food that was going to be given to you whatsoever, because you were basically living on the government's dime, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is people avoided poorhouses like they were going out of style. So if somebody put a factory in your countryside village and it looks like a poorhouse, are you going to want to go work in that thing? I don't think so, right? You're going to actually avoid it like the plague. Now, looking at this entire thing as well, you got to understand early resistance to wanting to work in a factory. These early workers did not want to work in factories whatsoever, because look at the lifestyle change that they're going to be going through. Something you need to understand is that, like, in the putting out system, in the cottage system, you didn't have to be at work by a certain time. You could work however much you wanted to. You could interrupt it with different tasks. You could do like an all-nighter and work an entire night. It was all about getting your stuff done on your own schedule. The putting out system and the cottage system is kind of like homework for y'all, right? You go home, you decide when you're going to do your flip. You sit down, you get your pens and your pencils out, you decide to do it, and you're like, you know what? I want a snack. You hit pause on this flip right now. You go off. You get a Pop-Tart. I'm a big fan of frosted blueberry Pop-Tarts, just to give you a heads up. That whole thing, you go off, you come back, you do it at your own pace, right? It's something very important to understand that the cottage industry and the putting out system is that earliest part of the consumer revolution where people were actually much more happy and could work on their own schedule. Another interesting fact is that they actually do believe, scientists do believe in the modern era, and Angelina Murphy, who was a senior here, actually taught me this, which is really interesting. Then we did a deep dive into some articles. Turns out she was very correct, that actually human beings in the putting out and cottage industry system used to actually go to sleep at night whenever they so chose or whenever they were tired, usually around like 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. But then they would wake up in the middle of the night and maybe work from like 10 to maybe 1 a.m. or like in the little, like somewhere in there. And then they would go back to sleep again, and they would dictate their lives based on how much work they had to do. Now, the thing about it is in these new cloth and cotton factories of the 1750s, you had to show up on time, do your stuff, get charged if you messed up anything, and also you had to work a lot of time to make some money, right? So the thing about it when we're looking at it as well, so we actually believe the way that humans sleep now with this 8-hour schedule and stuff like that, this big chunk in that night is actually a product of the Industrial Revolution and the idea of working in these early factories. Now, the thing about it, though, is as you can tell, this is not going to be fun. And a lot of people are going to actually resist working in these early factories as much as they possibly can. Now, early reluctance to working in factories is going to lead to large-scale child labor. The first people that are actually flooded into factories to get to work are actually orphans and people from foundling hospitals, right? So those foundling hospitals we talked about in the 1700s that are actually getting set up because it was in response to wet nursing and, of course, in response to infanticide and the stuff that was going on during the late 1700s. Those are going to be great little areas for places and factory owners to find workers because they can actually make a deal with the foundling hospital and they can bring these children in as laborers. They can also go to poorhouses and find laborers there. So the thing about it is that's going to actually set the tone for child labor moving forward, right? Which is a very, very tragic, disgusting thing. Now, the thing about it, though, as well, is you have to understand that it's not just the people that are going to have the view of the factory system like this. Now, the thing I'm about to talk about really quick is there's an art trend that's going on in the background that's kind of building momentum and steam and stuff like that. Now, in the late 1700s, into the French Revolution, the French Revolution truly catalyzed this art movement in a very big way and really brought it into the forefront. It was an art movement known as Romanticism, right? And Romanticism is an interesting art movement because it includes anything and everything, and they believe that all things can be the subject of art, right? It doesn't have to just be happy things. Like, I mean, when we look at the Renaissance, it's mostly happy stuff, unless you're looking at, like, the beheading of Judith beheading Holofernes by, like, Artemisia Gentileschi or something like that. But otherwise, it's pretty happy themes, right? Romanticism, on the other hand, will talk about death, suicide, like drinking, depression, like anything and everything. Some happy things, the beautifulness of nature, grandiose views of nature and things like that. And they also tend to take big swipes at the Industrial Revolution. Romantics typically are kind of like the hippies of the era. They don't really like the Industrial Revolution. So the two guys that I'm about to talk about are actually making fun of it and saying it's a bad thing, not actually saying it's a romantic view, like a beautiful thing, like you think like a romantic comedy, okay? Now, the romantic view of the growing factory system by people like Wordsworth and Blake is they actually really chastise the growing factories that were actually popping up during the late 1700s. For example, Edward Blake actually said in a very, very famous poem, he called the cotton mills satanic houses and satanic mills, where people went in there to basically be turned into a machine and then be a product that thing put out, right? Wordsworth, on the other hand, as well, lamented the loss of rural agrarian society and said that the cottage industry and people working at their own pace was the most beautiful part of history, and that we're throwing it away just to have this disgusting factory system pop up. So as you can tell, there are some people that are pretty anti-industrial Industrial Revolution, an anti-factory system going forward. And no group is more famous for being anti-factory system than these people known as the Luddites, right? The Luddites are going to pop up in the late 1700s as well. Basically, like they're based off a mythical figure known as Ned Ludd, right? Like Ned Ludd or the Luddites or the Luddites were actually a group of people that roamed the countryside in England and used small primitive weapons, hammers, like sticks, like anything they could get their hands on, and they destroyed early factory machines because they felt as though these machines were taking jobs away from them in the cottage industry and the putting out system. So they raided these different factories, destroyed them, set them on fire, broke these different machines and all these other different things as well, and they were known as Luddites, right? Now, Ned Ludd, we don't know if he was real or not. He's kind of like a mythical figure at this point, and as you can tell, he's wearing like a dress and stuff like that. He's actually wearing clothes he stole from one of the factories, right? Trying to show like the scraps and the upheaval and the destruction of the factory system. As you can see, the factory burning down in the background. Now, the interesting thing about this protesting, Wordsworth and Blake and the Luddites being against the factory system, it doesn't work in the long run, though, because money and economics are a really big driver, right? Because people are going to move into the factories regardless because they realize that, yes, it stinks, and yes, it's awful, and yes, it's the worst, but it's consistent money and consistent income, right? It's if I go to work and work for an hour, I will get paid X, right? As long as I don't break anything or do anything, right? Whereas with the putting out system in the cottage industry, there are some times where things could lull and you're actually kind of in a bad spot. And also, as more factories begin to pop up, the factories begin competing with each other, offering higher wages to try and get workers in the doors, right? So the poor people actually begin to gravitate towards the factory system, and they begin to seek work in droves. Now, looking at that, though, this especially blows up right around the turn of the century into the 1800s, right? Right around when Napoleon's taking over the entire continent of Europe. That's right there is when that steam engine starts getting strapped onto looms, starts getting strapped onto locomotives, starts getting strapped onto different machines, and they start becoming fully automated. So now you don't have to have your factory in the countryside anymore next to a running stream. You can actually put it where there are even more people in the cities. Now, this is going to lead to a huge thing known as urbanization. Now, urbanization is the massive influx of people into cities to find work, okay? Because as the factory systems begin to produce really, really cheap goods, it actually ends up like kind of undercutting the cottage system, undercutting the putting out system, and becomes the standard of the market. Buying cheaper cotton textiles that are in high production rather than buying a limited amount of things because the putting out system has a low supply, which means the demand is high, the price is too high, and people stop buying it, right? So in that process, as we actually look at this, we're looking at the growth of one particular city, none other than Manchester. Now, so the big thing about it, though, getting into it, the growth of Manchester, England, as can be seen on this graph, as you can tell, is growing massively throughout the years because people are flooding into those cities to find work. Now, where are they trying to find work? Where are they going to find work? Well, the poor families are being forced to turn to the factories, but not just the factories. They're also being forced to turn to many other areas because by the 1800s, factories are going to move from the countryside into the cities with steam power. Now, there's a new variety of jobs you can end up getting in the cities and stuff like that, okay? You can actually end up working in a factory or in one other place slightly outside the city, but we'll get to that here in about 2 seconds. But an interesting thing that's going down is you're seeing poor families move into these areas, right? They're leaving the countryside, leaving their rural villages, and they're finding jobs in these new areas. Now, an interesting thing going down is legitimately what would happen is whole families would enter into these job forces together. Usually what would happen is the father would enter into the negotiations with the manager and he would say, okay, I can work, my wife can work, my children can work. These working families are actually deciding to forego the ideas of education, forego school and things like that, and actually would rather send their children to work to be money earners for the family rather than actually sending them anywhere else. Now, an interesting thing about this as well is you had children in factories as young as 4 or 5 years old. Now, why is this? Because it's also free childcare. Because, let's use this one as a good example, okay? This right here is cotton mill work, right? As you can tell, this young child, this picture was probably taken Closer to the turn of the century, again in the late 1800s, with the quality and clarity of the actual picture itself. But as you can tell, even going in close to the 1900s, child labor became a super heavy facet of industrialism in Europe. And as you can tell, what his job is right here is to feed thread bobbins into this massive power loom. Now let's talk about that real quick. Could this actually damage his hands? Yes, there was lots and lots of injuries to children throughout this entire area, or throughout this entire era. Now, if you look right here as well, you have a mother that's actually working on this power loom, and look at this child right here. The children were actually basically this is a form of primitive daycare, right? Where they actually would sneak up underneath the machines, grab loose scraps, and walk around and stuff like that. And so cotton mill work is going to be a very large one. Now, this one, though, is the more dangerous one, but it's also the more profitable one, right? Coal mining work, okay? Coal mining and mine work was also very similar to the cotton mills as well, where entire families were entering into them. As we can tell, here's a father and a son dragging a massive coal cart out of a mine, okay? Now, look at also what they're wearing and how they're actually poised and stuff like that. They don't have their shirts on because it's so hot underneath the ground inside of these coal mines. The work is so arduous and backbreaking, which could lead to massive, broken bones. If that cart slips, it can easily kill you, but you did end up making quite a bit more money. Now, the interesting thing about it, though, as well, is we were kind of getting at and alluding to in this whole process, is that parents actually asked for child labor early on. They actually preferred it because mothers could keep an eye on their children, they could get paid a wage for their children, and then also it kept the family unit together. Now going forward though, an interesting little thing does begin to happen. Liberals and middle class people during this era begin to actually kind of believe that is a bad thing, right? So they start believing that child labor is a bad thing. Mr. Terry is not advocating for child labor. I want that point laid out very clearly. I'm not saying that, but what ends up happening is that they end up going against what the parents want, right? So and what ends up going down is we see the very first upcry or outticks of liberal reform. For example, this is a very important act that goes through in Great Britain by 1830, where things start getting really out of hand. Children are getting heavily injured. They also are their literacy rates are not growing as they should be properly. We're entrusting parents to educate them rather than anyone else. So liberal reform comes along in the 1830s. We'll talk a lot about that in this unit, who these liberals are, what they're advocating for, what class they make up, but it's mostly middle class people and people that exist inside of the factory ownership model. Now the Factories Act of 1833 is actually going to require that children from the age of 9 to 13 only work an 8-hour day. If you're from 14 to 18, you can work a 12-hour shift, and all factories are required to have elementary schools for workers under 9. Now, interesting little thing, this led to a massive decline in child labor under the age of 9 years old, mostly due to the fact that factory owners, instead of creating schools inside of these factories, actually just decided to stop hiring families with children under 9 years old, right? So something that you have to understand, though, is as we go forward, a lot of very intense stuff is going to be going down. And I'm actually going to just show you one more thing, and then we're going to cut it right here, okay? Now, there's positives and negatives to the Industrial Revolution up to this point. One, you got more wage earning power throughout the home. That's great. You have the ability to buy minor life luxuries. The consumer revolution is taking off. You can go out there, buy that bowl, buy that spoon, buy that stove for the family and stuff like that because wages are rising during these times of peace. Clothing and diets are improving. You actually have multiple sets of clothes. You can buy different products that are coming in through the ports. And also, due to the fact that the Columbian Exchange has taken finally full hold, novelty is becoming a thing. You can go out and buy tea to make at your home. You can go out and buy chocolate bars for your children and stuff like that if that's something that you want to do. Negatives, though, massive amounts of child labor. We also have 6-day-a-week work, and typically you would work 11 to 16 hours in these horrible mines and factories where it was hot. It was literally no ventilation. You could get diseases like tuberculosis very easily and many other things like that. Wage stagnation, of course, is something we've already talked about. It's going to be a massive negative. And then the housing market and food price fluctuations are only ever really going to affect the poor because their wages are pretty much locked in, right? We talked about, of course, the iron law of wages. They're going to stagnate. They're not going to rise as aggressively, and they're going to stay very close to that subsistence level. So when housing market fluctuations happen or food prices actually fluctuate due to famines or any kind of climatological cause, they're going to be the most affected by it. But what we're going to do, we're going to wrap it up right there. Y'all enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a great one. I'll see y'all soon.